welcome everybody to another episode of the Cross Country Super Podcast. And I'm joined by the lovely Jemma Sanderson over in Perth, as usual.
Hi, Darin.
How are you, Jemma? Thank you very much for joining me and doing another podcast. And of course, just quickly, this episode is proudly sponsored by Zagga, generating stable fixed income style returns with an investor-first approach. Why zig when you can Zagga? And we very much appreciate Zagga's support, of course. But it's lovely to see you over in Perth, Jemma. I hope you're having a good time over there.
Bit chilly, but probably not as bad as where you are, so all good.
Yeah, I've not actually known Perth to be chilly. It's always been beautiful when I've been there, even in the middle of winter. So,
well, actually, the sun is out, but it's cold.
well, that's good. That's good. Anyway, in this episode, we've decided to talk about property structuring, haven't we? And
we have.
Of course, property is a very, very, very popular asset class within the SMSF sector. And in fact, a lot of people set up an SMSF so that they can actually put some direct property into their super fund, which they obviously can't do it when they are a member of a public offer or APRA regulated fund. So big attraction there. But again, like anything, lots to unpack as far as how you go about doing it. Seems like a fairly simple concept, as all of these superannuation concepts do, but there's a lot of things to consider
Totally.
when you're looking to do that. So, Jemma, over to you. Where do you want to start the discussion?
Oh, well, where do we start? There's a whole bunch of things with property, and I think absolutely a lot of people, the motivation to set up a self-managed fund often comes with I've was at the pub or a barbecue and my mate told me I could buy a property in my super fund using my super. I want to do it, and and they plow on from there. So there's certain elements that everyone needs to be aware of. One of the biggest, again, motivators of setting up or using the self-managed fund is people have got super in there, and we particularly see it with business property. So they want to look to invest in business property that they will then lease back to their own business, and that's where it is a fantastic thing to consider. So the big ticket items here are looking at the investment restrictions. So we'll go through what that looks like and then ongoing how that flows out. Then the considerations with funding, because that in itself can then lead to further considerations on how you might structure it. So sometimes because the funding isn't necessarily there, and it's going to be more a passive investment from that perspective rather than it's associated with the business, whether there's an opportunity for people to gather their mates together and look at structuring that sort of thing from that perspective. So often we'll get the call, yep, I'd like to invest in property in my super fund. So what do I do about it? It's like, okay, great. Not a problem. Let's talk about it. So the big, often people are looking at getting the value out, like the capital growth from a residential property. So if we talk about residential property to start with, so there's nothing wrong with a self-managed fund buying a residential property off an unrelated party or off randoms. But under the super provisions, so SIS Act Section 66, you can't buy an investment property or residential property off a related party. So I often get asked that question, I've got this in my own name, can my super fund buy that from me? No, it can't, because it's residential. Now, sometimes it's a residential property, but it's being used for business purposes. So we see this with some medical practice rooms. It's a lovely old property, and it's been inside, has all been fit out, and it's got practice rooms in it. So then, because the test for that is it being used in wholly and exclusively in one or more businesses. So again, that's the business real property definition that's in that section 66. So firstly, back to residential, yes, you can buy a residential property in the fund. That's fine. A lot of people, you've got to understand the costs as well. So the challenge with property is always stamp duty, which we all hate, but it's a cost of doing business. So once you've looked at the capital you've got in the fund and you've paid for stamp duty and you're factoring all of that in, what's left over to pay for the property itself? So is there enough capital to acquire the property, or are you looking at a borrowing arrangement? Or do you have other money outside super that you can contribute in? So it leads a lot to that funding. The other thing from an investment perspective with residential property, again, we get asked this a lot. Oh, okay, I'll buy a residential property from randoms in my super fund, and then, I can rent it off my fund for my family, right? Particularly those lovely holiday houses that are in WA, down south in Eagle Bay. It's probably like the Byron Bay-ish equivalent, or Noosa equivalent. Down Dunsborough down there, no, you cannot. So again, one of the restrictions is you can't lease a residential property from the super fund to related parties. So even if you pay market rent. So that's also can be a challenge from that perspective. A lot of people, and I'm not personally a fan of the Airbnbs in a super fund, or just Airbnb more widely, because it's a lot of faffing around and whether you're actually getting the benefit from it. And it always comes back to, I've seen a lot of members, and we've picked up a lot of funds along the way, where the keenness of using super to buy property has really trumped the investment fundamentals of that property. And that being, I've got to buy a property with my super, I'll set up a fund, I'll buy it, I'll do an LRBA, etc., etc. But the property itself is rubbish. It's not generating a very good rental. There's been no capital growth. In Perth over COVID, the capital growth of properties has been unbelievable. And some of these super funds that we look at, their property that hasn't gone up at all, and they've had an LRBA in place for 10 years.
Oh no.
And yeah, so they've only just been washing their face, if that, with the interest payment or the repayments, with the rent and all those sorts of things. So I always revert back to, okay, well, you can do this, but should you, based on the investment fundamentals? Is it going to pay a good yield? And residential property invariably, as from a yield perspective, is pretty low. I know that there's a rental crisis across the country at the moment, but as a yield, rentals from residential tend to be low. So what's the return you're receiving? Well, it's capital growth over that period of time. Are you actually going to see that? Because if you're not going to see that, then why are you bothering? And then the challenge at the moment, I think, with any of these sorts of considerations is, particularly when you're looking at funding from a limited recourse borrowing arrangement, then it's, will the bank lend you the money? The rates are pretty hefty at the moment. So with that funding criteria, is the property going to, I like to use the term, wash its face? So is it going to generate enough revenue and yield net of the property management fees and maintenance, and looking at council rates and water rates and all of those ongoing costs? Is it going to be able to pay the interest and the principal? Because most banks will not lend on an interest-only basis with respect to these loans anymore. And then you're looking at, in that scenario, if it's not going to wash its face, then it's super contributions, the regular concessional contributions that might need to be used to make those repayments from that perspective. And then you're not really building other wealth in the fund. I mean, you're paying down that loan, but if the asset itself is a bit rubbish, then again, are you really getting that value? It's all been just this whole luster of, oh, I've got a property in my super fund, and isn't it awesome? So that's definitely a consideration, that the investment fundamentals there.
Yeah, it's like anything, isn't it, Gemma? And not just with issue superannuation, but if you are going to make an investment, the case for the investment has to be justifiable, doesn't it? It can't just be the concept of,
Totally.
I think this is a good idea just because I'm in love with the idea. It's still got to have the fundamentals of, especially with the sole purpose test and trustees, it's got to be a viable investment, no matter what it is. We're talking about property now, but
Yep.
it can be anything, can't it?
And we see that a lot as well. People get, we all love something new and shiny, and so it's like, oh, we've got to get in on the ground with crypto, as an example. And then, but then people that didn't understand how crypto worked. And then when it went up massively, and a lot of people, don't get me wrong, they made a lot of money, but then a lot of people bought in at that level thinking it would go up, and then it crashed down, and they didn't understand, because they didn't understand the investment, then the fundamentals of that investment, again, they didn't quite understand how that all worked. But it's across the board. So it's, again, we can get overawed by the concept, and using your super to invest in things that are not just public offer fund available. So they're non-vanilla investments. So I know we're talking about property. I can buy a car in my super fund. The whole artwork, all those sorts of things from in the past. If you don't see it as often anymore because of the requirements there, but
Yeah.
absolutely those and when people are like, oh, tax here and tax there and tax savings here, there, and everywhere, sure. But the investment decision should be the first cab off the rank to consider, is it a good investment or not? And likewise, oh, well, I won't sell that because the tax implications. It's like, well, what's the investment decision? If the investment decision is to sell it because the recommendation is it's fully valued, I'm talking shares there, or it's the best price you think you're going to get for the property, if it is a property, then you will pay tax. But, is it still the right investment decision? So I feel like I'm, overemphasizing that, but it's really, really important. I think if people are putting to that point, life savings into a very, very chunky asset in their super, then that, the diversification piece there is important. And you don't want to like all your eggs in one basket with property.
Yeah.
In super is often what happens.
Yeah. And I think funnily enough, property probably harbors the greatest risk as far as this goes, simply because I think if I could make a generalization, most Australians think that they're familiar with investing in property because they've got a mortgage, right? So
Yep.
a lot of people feel comfortable with this asset class as opposed to shares or something like that. I know it's a ridiculous concept, but people like assets that they can kick.
Touch.
Yeah, touch and kick.
Yep.
They're not that comfortable sometimes with just a share certificate to 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 obviously prove your title to that particular asset. So I think even in this case, it's even more so to be conscious of the traps, because a lot of people are just like, oh yeah, I got a mortgage. I know how this works. I can do an LRBA. I know how that sort of works. But it's not, because of your perceived familiarity with the asset class, does not make it any easier or any more prudent, actually, to allocate funds from your SMSF to a property, especially
And I
with.
think the other thing with that is when you've bought your house, your home, and you've got probably a massive mortgage that goes along with that, that's an emotional decision. And so that emotional decision does get carried across to often like a self-managed super fund or an investment property when you're looking at that. And it shouldn't be. It should be a business investment decision, not an emotional decision.
Yeah.
And that again, I feel like that can often get lost as part of the process.
Yeah.
So once you've found the good investment and you've done the metrics and you're like, yes, I really want to invest in this residential property, and you're buying it from an unrelated party, so you've ticked that box. So then the other consideration with all of this is okay, great, Darin, we found the investment, and maybe by the time you go through all the next bits and pieces, you've lost the opportunity to buy it because the property market is so hot at the moment. But anyway, we'll ignore that part. So then the consideration is, okay, I need it's going to cost me $1 million, including stamp duty. So I've got $500,000 between myself and my spouse that we're going to consolidate together into super. So how do we fund that purchase? So this is the consideration of, do we do a limited recourse borrowing arrangement or not? And what's required from that perspective. But then we've got the other considerations with well, can we make some contributions? So there could be other entities and other resources outside super to be able to make a contribution of the 360 grand each into super, and then you can buy it outright. So win, there's a win from that perspective. However, a lot of people are looking at the limited recourse borrowing arrangements and they're taking on board or basically they've got to be comfortable with the interest rates that apply to those because they're pretty high. Most lenders in that space are sort of not even second tier, third tier lenders. Some of them I often go, oh, that's a new one, never heard of them before, because the big guys are out. They haven't wanted to touch them for some time because of that limited recourse nature. So if we go back and you can put in your 360,000 each, or maybe it's only you need $1 million, you've got $500,000. So maybe let's put in 250 each or a bit more to have some cash buffer. You buy the property. You've got to make sure you've got the trustee of the fund. So Jemma Super Proprietary Limited as trustee for the Jemma Super Fund goes on the offer, and the super fund pays the deposit and then pays at settlement. So where there's not a borrowing in place, that can be reasonably straightforward. Then any lease agreement needs to be in the name of the trustee of the fund. Obviously, a bank account in the name of the trustee of the fund, all the ins and outs from there. So that's a lot more straightforward when you can buy it outright with the right funding in place. Now, sometimes even when you can do that, people will often go down the path of a limited recourse borrowing arrangement, because if I've used my $500,000 that I have in capital in super, and then I make a contribution of $500,000, then 100% of my fund is in a property. So the diversification's not there. And then if I see another investment that I might want to invest in, including another property, where might I fund that from? I'm going to have to find some other money to maybe make a contribution to get the deposit together to then do a borrowing perhaps.
Yeah.
So sometimes people look at, all right, well, even though we could fund it 100% with capital, maybe we do put in place a borrowing so that keeps some capital aside for the next investment to perhaps diversify some more, etc. So when we're looking at the borrowing arrangements, and this is sometimes where people can come a cropper, is that it's not factored into their numbers. So they're thinking, yep, I've got $500,000. Let's get $1 million property or $1.5 million property. They're thinking 80% LVR rather than the limited recourse borrowing arrangements where the banks have lowered those. Because they're limited recourse. And so by the time those bits and pieces get factored in, and then with the LRBA, we've obviously got all those requirements there. So under section 67A and B of the SIS Act, 67A goes through the consideration. So it's you can, as long as the fund can acquire the asset under the general investment rules, then there's your tick. Then with properties, it's got to be held custodially. So it can't be held in the name of the trustee of the fund. So you'd have to have Jemma Property Proprietary Limited as bear trustee for Jemma Super Proprietary Limited as trustee for the Jemma Super Fund. And I've even run out of lines on my screen here to get to that. So it's quite a long title that you've got to make sure that it is not in the name of the trustee of the fund. So then say you had your $500,000 in capital, and you had the ability to put in another $500,000 to get your $1 million property. Perhaps you just do a 50% LVR and borrow the balance from the bank, and that still gives you another $500,000 of capital for the next thing. So the considerations here is you've got your limited recourse borrowing arrangement. It will be principal and interest. Some banks might do because it's independent. So the fund is borrowing from an external lender, then you could negotiate differing terms. But sometimes you've got the consideration that if I can contribute 500,000, then do I just lend that to my fund and go down the path of looking at a related party loan? And that's also available. So the consideration with that is if it is related party, it's got to be benchmarked to the tax office's rates. And again, that's pretty hefty. The rate for the current year came out, and I'm going to forget what it is. I think it's 8.87%.
Yeah, something
So
like that.
so really
It's
high.
high.
It's high. A couple of years
It's
ago, it
high.
was 5.3. So that's how that cookie crumbles. There's the tax determination 2016-16 and the practical compliance guideline from 2020 2020/5. No, 2016/5 rather, and that goes through the tax officer's benchmarking and safe harbour areas. So with residential property or property, you've got an LVR there to have a look at. Principal and interest payments, that can be where people fall foul. They don't make regular monthly principal and interest payments over a 15-year term with respect to those. So then you're back to, is it washing its face considerations?
Yeah.
And the other thing that I'm chatting to some people recently, and they were like, yep, we've got our $500,000, we'll borrow $500,000, we'll buy this property and we think that it's going to go up in value. We'll get some renovations done on it and it's going to go up in value. And I'm like, great. So what's your intention then? Are you going to rent it out then? And they were like, yeah, we'll probably do that. And then we'll use the equity to buy another one. Now, that concept works outside super, but it does not work inside super.
Yeah.
So you can't use the equity that you appreciate in that value to then go to the bank and say, right, I've got a property now worth 1.2 million, and use that as security for the borrowing on the next one. And people often misunderstand that as well and just think, oh yeah, well, I can just build on that. Like that's how they've built an investment property portfolio outside.
It gets back to the point that I was making before, is that's that whole familiarity with, I'm familiar with investing in property, so I can do this and I can make these strategies without actually understanding that the superannuation overlay onto it
Yeah, totally.
creates a whole separate environment that you've got to adhere to. And you raised a really good point as well, Jemma, that you talked about diversification, and obviously a property is a large value asset and a lumpy asset. And some people just go all in and say, well, let's start off the SMSF by buying a resi property or whatever, and that can be funding it with an LRBA. It is important to note here that will put you on the ATO radar.
If you're 100%,
Because it wasn't so long ago they sent out letters to try and determine whether or not SMSFs were taking that lack of diversification into the investment strategy account, the way it was put together. So it is important to note that the ATO is pretty hot on this.
Yep.
And it's not all beer and Skittles. If you do go down that path, then just know that I'm not
Someone's
saying
watching.
you're raising your head completely, but maybe just the top of your head is showing for the ATO. So there is undoubtedly a lot of scrutiny there. I think another good point you made, Jemma, is around that related party thing. And I've been to several presentations to emphasize the fact that if you're going to buy a property, make sure that you put the deposit in the super fund's name. You can't just go to an auction and go, oh, that looks pretty good. Oh, actually, that looks really good for my SMSF. Oh shit, I don't have my checkbook with me. I've got my own checkbook, or I can just write this out and we can deal with the
deal with it later. I'll call my advisor on Monday.
Yeah,
and
that's right. Hey, Jemma, I found this great property. I didn't have my super fund checkbook, but it's all right. I covered the deposit personally. So how do we unwind all that and get the property into the super fund? Well, the unfortunate answer will be you can't.
Well, and this is the thing, and this is why it's so important to have the planning up front. And the other thing when I'm having these conversations with people is, well, what is your longer term intention? So the scenario I gave earlier was, we'll do a renovation, and I'll get to the impact of that. So we'll do a renovation, then okay, you're going to sell it. Oh no, well then rent it out. Okay, so then it's a long-term asset, and then what is your exit strategy on that? Because there has to be one. And again, we've been talking so far about setting up a new fund to buy property, but the other consideration with this is we might have people that have already got a fund in place and they're looking at different different asset classes, and let's go buy a property, whether it's business or residential, using some of my super. And we've seen with the Division 296 tax, those lumpy assets may potentially cause some substantial cash flow issues where they go up in value, but the yields are lower. So how that might be factored into the equation as well. So I'm definitely seeing that as a consideration. And I think the other thing that people also perhaps not miss, but maybe it's worthwhile bringing it to their attention is, yes, they like something, and I like your terminology, not just that you can touch it, but you can kick it. You can kick it. So they're like, yes, it's there, it's robust, etc. But if they also own their own home and maybe some other investment properties, they've got a very high overall allocation to property. And if you talk to anyone from an investment fundamentals perspective, and thankfully I'm not in that investment space, they would say, well, you just don't put all your eggs in that one basket. And sure, you might have benefited from capital growth and things like that, but is that from that longer term? So again, that comes down to how that might be looked at there. And I did have another point to make, but I can't remember what it was.
Well, it's actually a great consideration. And another thing that you mentioned briefly is that, I don't know how popular it is, but I know it's come across my radar a little bit that younger people are getting a little bit innovative, I suppose you can say, and saying that, oh, why don't we join a super fund together and we can purchase a property as mates, right, within the superannuation environment. But again, it comes down to how lumpy the asset is, what sort of liquidity requirements you need, and those circumstances will change as you progress down your own life cycle. And
then getting them out of the fund,
yeah, 100%.
oh, that's a disaster.
So what if one of the mates decides that, oh, Jemma, it's not really working for me anymore. Can I exit? Can I exit? You guys can continue, but can I exit? And then unwinding that strategy will be a complete nightmare. I do applaud.
And that's if they're still friends.
Yeah, exactly.
What if they got a falling out, or
that would be
they
the
get
worst
married,
scenario. That
and
would
they've
be
got
the
their
worst scenario.
partners in there? Oh, disaster.
I mean, the worst scenario is, oh, I used to be his mate, but I hate his guts now. So, but didn't you have an SMSF? Yeah, seemed like a good idea at the time, but don't do it because it was a nightmare to try and unwind that whole process. So as I said, I applaud the innovative thinking, but again, it comes back to the practicality of the situation where, it's a good idea, but there are these
execution not going to work.
Maybe it's not the best thing from a practical perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And it's 100%. And I mentioned earlier some of these funds that we've picked up, and they've had an LRBA in place for 10 years. And at the time, it was all within LVRs, etc. And they've been making regular repayments, and that's been paid off. That's some of these, the properties haven't washed their face, so all their super contributions have gone in. And then you've got, there's insurance that also needs to be sorted out for the property, all these other costs. So where their fund really just has a property with a borrowing in it, because all of the cash flow has just been chewed up by the repayments, and then they actually sell it and they barely make any money off because the values have gone down, or whatever that might look like. So again, we've got so that exit strategy and where you're going to land with, okay, is it a long-term hold? with rented out. I've got some clients that are basically have land banked in their super fund, and because a developer will pick this up in the future. Now, because of the Division 296 provisions, that is less attractive, because every year that gets valued, it's likely to go up, and they're going to be paying tax along the way on that. So we're looking at how to, any new ones, how we might restructure, or do we pull out, what that looks like. But again, stamp duty is always a bit of a nightmare from that perspective. So I always think about what's the exit strategy, what's the long-term intention, and then that can guide how it might be structured. So I just want to quickly touch on that renovation piece that I've sort of alluded to earlier.
Yeah.
So I'm just using this particular client scenario from last week because they are in the game. So he's a project manager for property developments. So you again, you've got that mentality of, and where they've made money before, they've bought a pretty rubbish property and they've done a whole bunch of renos on it whilst living in it. So they've basically they're flippers or whatever they're called. So they flip houses, main residence exemption with the renovations. And we're talking extensive renovations. They've got all the contacts, all these sorts of things. So they're thinking, well, why aren't I using my super to do this similar arrangement? And of course, with limited recourse borrowing arrangements, you need to be careful, because Section 67B has got the replacement asset provisions. And so that goes through, can you change an asset and then does it still accord with the 67A? Now, property was always one that there was this, I think it's subsection 8, that says any other asset as like stipulated in the regulations. And so there was never any regulations that accompanied that to talk about property. So the tax office came out with a ruling in 2012 that went through 2012 or 2010. Now I'm testing myself. 2012, I think it was, because these provisions came out in 2010 that moved from 67.4A to 67A and 67B. And so it did go through what would be considered to be a replacement asset under 67B and in the property context. And something like a renovation wouldn't make it fall foul. So that's quite good. So in my client scenario, yes, you can do a renovation. That's okay, as long as it doesn't fundamentally change the asset. Then the consideration with that, though, is, again, if you're outside super, you go to the bank and say, yep, can I borrow another couple of hundred to do this reno, blah, blah, blah. You can't do that in a self-managed fund. You can only borrow to acquire the asset or to do some bits and pieces up front. That's it. You can't 6 months in go and use the equity to increase that loan. So the initial loan has to be for the acquisition, and anything at that point. You can't increase that loan at any point in time. And it's actually amazing when we do pick up funds where in a refinance from bank to bank, the loan gets increased. And I'm just like, oh God, here we go. Anyway, we digress. So with that renovation, the fund has to fund it, and it would fund it from its own capital. That's the only place that could happen. So that could be, again, contributions coming in order to fund that. So that part in itself is okay. But now we need to make sure that my chap here is a project manager for property developments. He can't do that for free in the fund because of the non-arm's length expense and non-arm's length income provisions. So we've got to overlay all of these things. So by the time, Bob has done the project management and development, he has to charge a fee for that, because that's what his qualification is. If he doesn't charge a fee for that, then we've got non-arm's length expenses and non-arm's length income on any subsequent income generated from that asset. So it's just like those sorts of things we also need to be mindful of as things flow on from there. Now, because he's in the game in that property development role, then we've got that concern. But if he was, I'm just trying to think of, if he was a pharmacist and then on the weekends organised all the bits and pieces, then as the trustee of the fund, doing all of that, it's a different scenario. But again, just really needing to be overly cautious on that front. So back to some of my original comments where people think, oh, yep, I can do this and I'm going to make a good profit and it's going to be a good outcome, but they don't factor in the costs. So the cost being, obviously, you've got to set up the fund. Have you got life insurance in your current benefits that needs to come? You need new insurance, so there's a cost there. You need a bare trust arrangement, so you need another company in place. Loan agreements, loan application, like bank fees, all coming through, including the legals, because they'll want to have a look through everything, stamp duty, settlement costs. So all of it all starts to add up. And once people are aware of that, they might still be like, yep, off we go, let's plow ahead. But we definitely need to be careful and make sure people are fully aware of that from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Trustee awareness is so important. And of course, they're responsible for everything that happens to the superannuation fund. And it's not just as easy as, we always make the assumption that, oh, surely I can just pay for this, or I can pay for that, particularly when you're talking about renovating a property or that sort of thing. But of course, you got an LRBA in place, you can't do that. It's very, very restrictive. And you know, again, unless you know that, it's so easy to get caught out by those things.
And we have seen also situations where it's been a business property, which I will talk about now, that people have gone into. And once they get there, so when it's commercial property, the rules are a bit different in terms of like just the leasing, the way that commercial property gets leased. There's a lot of, there's a leasing fee that the property manager, and I'm talking WA here, and I presume that it's similar across the board.
Yeah.
So the leasing fee just to lock in the tenant can be substantial. So there's a cost. Then you've got again, your interest and principal payments. You can generally outgoings, you pass on the cost of that, so that's all good. But all these extra costs that come through, and I have had clients where they have bought and it was medical rooms. It was a residential property that was used in medical rooms, and they went in and did a bit of an extra fit out in there, and then they found a massive roof defect, so they had to fix the roof, and that cost quite a lot of money. And then the fund it was a big asset in terms of the context of the fund. And so we had the consideration of, well, how do we get money into the fund to pay for that? Because exhausted their concessional contributions. They were high income earners, so they didn't want to put non-concessional contributions in there. So those are the other considerations coming through. I've had other scenarios where they've exhausted their non-concessional contributions, and then from a cash flow perspective, it was still a real struggle. So that is so important to run through it from that perspective.
Yeah, it goes back to your point of the asset looking after itself and generating revenue, doesn't it? I mean, you can't be reliant on just future contributions funding the strategy. I mean, there's got to be some building of wealth in order to make the strategy work. Otherwise, you're just forking over money that's arguably potentially just going into a bottomless pit without actually having
benefiting you at all.
Appreciation of your superannuation savings, which would be the worst scenario because it's defeating the purpose of doing the whole thing in the first place.
And also, again, we've been talking primarily about people setting up new funds to do this. My view on life, excuse me, there is, I know that ASIC came out with a couple of 100,000. For me, it's 400, 500, if not 1 million, that a self-managed fund starts to become economical. Obviously, there's exceptions to that, particularly where people are looking at maybe buying a business property, et cetera, but always going back to what I was harping on about a lot, that those investment fundamentals. If you're going to spend $1 million on a property, and I find it fascinating that I would have spent more time critiquing a new phone than buying my current house. You know, I walked through it 10 minutes, if that, and then we were like, yep, let's buy it. As opposed to all the research you do online to buy a phone. I'm just using it as an example. So again, that being super critical about that as an investment asset. So get the pest and the building inspection. Make sure that like get an extra like engineering report done if that's what, if you're about to spend $1 million or whatever it might be. Like all of those things definitely need to be taken into consideration. Now I'm just conscious of time because of course we're good at staying to time, aren't we, Darin? So
We're
that's
good
with
at going off piste,
yeah, very good at
which
going off
gets us into
piste.
time trouble.
Yeah, it does. So residential, obviously, there's a whole bunch of things to consider. Now with business property, a lot of those considerations remain. It's just that the business real property is a bit of a golden goose when it comes to super, because you can acquire it from a related party. And we do see that a little bit. So Section 66 has an exception, and that includes business real property. So we often do see that where people have already got a business property in a discretionary trust or in their own names, and there's an opportunity there for that to be transferred into their super fund and acquired by the fund. So that doesn't limit them from that perspective, or they just, again, buy it fresh from, like I said, randoms. So they can certainly do that. With a commercial property, the other consideration on acquisition is if it is with a borrowing arrangement, you've obviously got to tick the boxes there in terms of the correct names. But also from a GST perspective, you want to make sure that as much as possible it's a going concern. So then you're not paying stamp duty on the GST inclusive price. So that's just something else to come through. And then if it is being leased to a related party, you've then got all those related party considerations. So it's got to be at market. You'd need to have a formal lease agreement in place, and the payments of rent in accordance with that lease agreement, making sure that it is, again, from that commercial or market perspective. So the outgoings are paid for by the tenant and not the landlord. And then it's also worthwhile making sure in that agreement, looking at who is paying for and owns the fit out. So sometimes we see that then the super fund as the landlord buys the asset, and then the tenant wants to claim all the tax deductions, so they do the fit out, and then that's, that works out fine. But then you need to have, is there a make good clause in the lease agreement? Because if that lease terminates because for whatever reason, because they're related parties there, it's a little bit different. But in terms, if there isn't a make good clause in that lease agreement and it terminates, which means that the super fund basically gets to keep the fit out that's in there, then there's actually an acquisition by the fund from that related party of that fit out, and it is not covered by a Section 66 exemption. And there is a tax office determination on that. And now I'm talking long time ago, 15 years ago, there was a whole slew of tax office determinations and rulings that came out about SMSFs. And this was to do with contributions. So it would have been 2010. I reckon it's SMSF ruling 2010/1. And if I've got that right, then I'm going to give myself a pat on the back. And that goes through the acquisition of assets from a related party in those sorts of situations. And because it's not business real property, because it's a fit out, and then it looks at things that are not insignificant in value. And this comes back to the ability for a super fund with property, if you, and I'm going back to residential here, we're good at digressing. So let's say the fund entirely with its own capital had bought a piece of land and then was going to construct a new property on that and used a related party builder, because that does happen as well. Then they were the consideration there was, well, if you're using a related party builder, every time that related party builder puts a brick or a window frame or windows or whatever onto that land that the super fund owns, is that the acquisition by the fund from that related party of a brick, of a tap of a shower, whatever that looks like. And that ruling also covered on that to say, yes, it was, if it's not insignificant in value. You love the double negatives. So that gave rise to people putting in place agency agreements between the two, because the other thing with that was people saying, right, well, I've got my own residential construction company.
Yeah.
I'll buy a piece of land in the fund and then I'll do it at mates rates. So now
Yeah.
that obviously can't be done either with the non-arm's length expense provision. So anyway, I digressed back to residential, hadn't covered off on everything. And of course, there's probably still a whole bunch of other stuff to consider. So business property, again, that golden goose, but there's things that need to be looked at substantially from that perspective. And then I've lost my train of thought, of course. So similarly, you can structure things in the same fashion, limited recourse borrowing arrangements in place. If you can, again, make sure that it's washing its face rather than you having to put more capital in there. But we've got that consideration with business real property just being a little bit better to manage on that ongoing basis, purely because you can lease it to a related party. But anytime you're doing anything with a related party, it really needs to be schmick, and you need to just cover off on absolutely everything.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit ironic, isn't it? But people shouldn't be lured into a false sense of security like you often can if you've got a related party transaction. It shouldn't be the way it is, but sometimes it's like, oh yeah, it's me that's leasing the premises because it's my business and it's going into my super. So it's all me. So it's all sweet. It's okay.
Yeah.
But as you
Yeah, we'll
point
sort it
out,
out at year end. It'll
yeah,
be
exactly.
fine.
And I
It'll be
mean,
fine.
it's human nature to almost think like that, isn't it?
Yep.
It's only me. Like
It's
it's not
all in the same. It's all the
yeah, it's
same.
not
It's the same
involving
person.
anybody else. So it's all right. I'll figure it out. But it's almost the opposite, isn't it? You've almost got to be more vigilant about dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Something simple like having a formal lease in place and
Yes,
adhering to it. I mean, that's pretty simple. And if it was a third party, you wouldn't even think twice about it, would you? You wouldn't.
exactly.
You wouldn't have a third party in there without them signing a lease to say how much they're going to pay you on a monthly basis or a
And
yearly.
when, and
Yeah,
who's
exactly.
responsible for outgoings, and who's responsible for this, and what's the term of the lease, and then is there an automatic, like, do you have an extra 3 years that you can, like, those
Yeah,
terms, like
yeah.
all of that is really, really important if you were, again, leasing to a random. So you need to treat the related party as if they're a random.
But it's understandable, as I said, because the person is just the one person a lot of the time. There's just some sort of complacency is likely to kick in, but it's, as I said, it's almost, and you pointed out, it's almost more important to make sure that all of these things are bedded down before you actually enter into
Yep.
any sort of arrangement like that.
And the other thing is people, yeah, they go off. They've been told, yes, you can do it, and they'll go off. And you indicated earlier that they're at the auction. Oh yeah, here we go, 20 grand deposit. Off we go. Yep, I did it. I bought it. And it's like, oh, geez, Darin, we only spoke about it Friday. Like, no, no. Anyway, because these days with setting up a fund and director IDs and tax file numbers and ABNs, the rollover process has become so much more strict with the super stream, all that, the
Yeah.
actual setting up the fund so that it's ready to go it takes a lot longer now than it used to. So, that keenness that people might have from that perspective. Now, we've spoken about the ability for a fund to buy an asset outright, so LRBA, or just, again, with its own capital. And so, that's available for people out there. Now, sometimes, and you indicated earlier the concept of, well, let's set up a fund with my mate and
Yeah.
together we'll aggregate our super and then we'll buy an asset. So, yep, you can do that. The other available option there, if you do have that mate, is the structure of an arrangement with an entity. So I'm talking here about an unrelated trust or an unrelated company. So this is where we're looking at the provisions in the SIS regulation. So we're talking now in-house assets, and what we don't want is to fall foul of the in-house assets test, but there's certain exceptions to that, and one of them is a trust that or an entity that accords with the provisions of Division 13.3 in the SIS regs, and more specifically 13.22C goes through the requirements, and 13.22D, those are two together, the requirements for that sort of entity to be exempt from the in-house assets test. Now, that's where it is where the fund might 100% would fall foul of the in-house assets test. So I haven't articulated that well, and I apologise. So if the fund wanted to use a unit trust, and this could be the situation where they've bought some land and they want to construct on it later, and just for the and they've got maybe another entity within their family group that also wants to contribute to that, and they want to contribute perhaps in disproportionate proportions along the way. So using that unit trust might enable, okay, it's 60% from the fund, 40% from the family trust. Then when it comes to construction, that might be flipped around a bit. As long as all of the unit issues are done at market value, then you might end up with ultimately the situation where the fund owns 55 and the trust owns 45, but overall the family group owns 100%. That unit trust itself has got quite strict provisions attached to it, which is in 13.22C. The big ones there are you can't have shares in other entities or units in other unit trusts. So watch out for cash management trusts, because it's not a bank account, it's a cash management trust, and therefore that 13.22C trust can then be an in-house asset. The other thing is that no charges can be held over an asset within that trust, and that would include a builder's lien. So if it is land that each party is contributing to, and then you employ a builder to build on that land, invariably the builder will slap a caveat over the property, and to protect their interest. And when that happens, that is a charge. And so then all of a sudden, that's one of the circumstances in SIS regulation 13.22D, and that can mean that that is no longer exempt from the in-house assets test. And then you've got to overlay, well, it's an in-house asset now. What's the value? If it's more than 5%, you've got to put in place a plan by the next 30 June to dispose of that interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is one very, very quick, succinct option. But another one that was where I was getting at is we've got the in-house assets test, which prohibits a fund from having an investment in a related party. So when it comes to entities, you have a look at the SIS Act and its section 70A through 70E that goes through what control is, what a related party is, these Part 8 associates, and how that gets drilled down with companies, trusts, partnerships, individuals, and then what control is considered to be. So control is more than 50%, and that's either by influence, which would be directorships, and if you and I were in a company together, and I was your boss and I was a cantankerous person, and you were like, oh, well, there's no way I can do anything without against Jemma without her say so. So then I would have sufficient influence over you. So then that would fall that would be controlled by me. Terrible example, Darin, because, of course, you would never do that. And of course, I'm not cantankerous ever.
No, I would never describe you as that.
So there's that element by the influence, and then there's by ownership. So if my super fund owned 50% of the units and your super fund owned 50% of the units, and then in the trustee company, we were 50-50 of the shares, and then we were both equal directors and neither of us had a casting vote, then we're 50-50 down the line. That means that trust wouldn't be a related party of either of our super funds. So therefore, the in-house assets test wouldn't kick in. Now, the benefit of that arrangement with the mates coming in is that trust that is not restricted by the 13.22C and 13.22D provisions. So that means that the trust itself can borrow and do a development in that entity. So where we see this works well is where it is the mates. So just be really careful and make sure that no one's married to the best mate's sister. You know, that happens a bit. And then, of course, they all get captured as Part 8 associates. So just watch out for that. I always say that. So none of you are married to anyone else's sister or brother or, you know, that. Oh, no, no. Oh, actually, yeah, that's right. That's what happened. Whoopsie. Anyway, so watch out for that. And so that trust can do a property development. It can borrow in its own right. So then you're not subject to the LRBA restrictions at the super fund level. You still have to run that trust with the overlay of the arm's length provisions in section 109. So that is that the fund can't be detrimented, has to do it at arm's length. And then you've got to overlay the non-arm's length expense and income provisions. So there's always that Goldilocks approach, as I call it, in the middle of it's just right. So the super fund can't be detrimented, but the super fund can't have the advantage. So what's our porridge in the middle, just right? And that's where it's market valuations, it's benchmarking of whatever needs to happen there. So I've certainly seen situations, and it generally is, it's more than just two mates. It's usually three or four, and they get together, and it's all done independently, but they all get the benefit of it from that perspective. But I also see the flip side of that when I say, look, there is a way we could structure this differently, where you can, you know, do the property development or whatever that looks like, but you can't have more than 50%. And they're like, oh, no, well, I don't want to share the returns. So then it's like, well, then super is possibly not the correct place for that to happen.
No, and it's a tricky one. You touched on this, that it goes beyond face value.
Mm.
Like
That's
that
right,
whole control
100%.
concept goes beyond face value. You can say anything about, oh, no, 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 our shares evenly split. But if you've got a dominant person, as you say, that, well, I can't stand up to them. So whatever, pretty much whatever they say goes.
Goes, yep.
Um, you know, the regulator's looking through that. It's not the corporate veil, but the structural veil to actually see how the operation works. And that can be a difficult one, you know.
The
And
other thing with the companies is that people, and this is very widespread. It's very common, and so I'm not saying that it's the wrong thing to do, in more widely. But when we're looking at these sorts of structures, the off-the-shelf constitution is often not appropriate because
yeah,
it might say, you know, someone has to have a casting vote or a
yeah,
veto, and then that means that they're caught. That their fund is. So if that was me, my fund, it's an in-house asset of mine. So for you, you're like, oh, well, whatevs. But then I have to restructure it. So then what's the impact of that on you? Because I might be like, well, I've got to sell this. Darin, can you buy my units? And you're like, oh, well, with what money? Because
yeah.
I've, you know, put all my eggs in this property basket that we were going to do and, you know, make all this money from. So it's, yeah, those sorts of things
Yeah.
certainly come through.
And in these scenarios, it's probably even more important to try and avoid falling foul of those in-house asset rules. Because let's
Absolutely.
be perfectly honest, unless you've got one of those massive SMSFs, the value of a property is more than likely to exceed the 5% limit.
Yep, definitely.
And then you're in a whole world of hurt. You got a lumpy asset. It's not like you and I could decide that, oh, we're in trouble. That's all right. I can get rid of the property over the weekend and we'll be
Mm,
sweet by Monday. It
doesn't
doesn't
work that
doesn't
work.
work
Yep,
that way. So all of these things are so important to get right, because the world of hurt you would find yourself in once you've breached those rules, maybe obviously not intending to do so, but it doesn't save you from being in that whole world of hurt, of probably thinking, maybe I shouldn't have done this in the first place. And you don't want to be in that situation, do you? But you could
no.
be lamenting, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done this in the first place.
And it's like that planning up front and being aware, and you know, a little bit of awareness is dangerous. And I've referred to the barbecue talk, and you're at the pub. And of course, everyone's situation is different. So the whole thing of, oh, well, I just bought a property in my super fund and it's done real well, and this, and this, and go on, Darin, you should do it too. And you're like, yeah, I can do that. I spoke to Jemma. Jemma told me all about it. She knows. She's the expert. She knows, even though, you know, Jemma might be, oh, I'm really bad at picking up professions here. Can't even think of them. Gemma's a psychologist, so she knows all about super. She got it nailed. And then you go off and do that, and then you fall foul. And the cost of fixing it and fixing these things is astronomical. So it's isn't it all the P's? Piss poor planning creates something performance. So I would, you know, put that, overlay that with this sort of thing as well. And we're not talking a small transaction of buying a tranche of shares. These are chunky
No.
transactions. You've got to get them right. And back to the invest, like do your due diligence. I think that's probably the messaging from this is the due diligence on the asset, the structure, and then the exit strategy and the succession if it's a long-term investment. So like farming land or business property, you know, generally it's long term. So just making sure that all of those boxes are ticked before you're even looking at a property, pretty much.
Jemma, I was going to suggest that if I consulted you to buy a property, you might have been one of Homer Simpson's mates at the nuclear power plant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Surely that would qualify you for giving me advice as to what I should do
Oh
with.
yeah. Oh, or, you know, Barney or Mo at the pub, they'd know.
Could be, yeah.
Barney would know all
Mo would
about
be
it.
a font of knowledge, wouldn't he?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
I was going to quickly ask, or just really quickly cover off the topic. Um, what happens once the LRBA is exhausted? Does the property have to actually come out of the holding trust and into the SMSF? How does that all work?
So there, it used to be that that was the case, and if you didn't do it, then there was some in-house asset issues. However, then there was a legislative instrument came through that said you didn't have to do it, although it's prudent, really. Otherwise, you tend to then be knocking around with an entity or a company that you don't really need anymore. But depending on the state you're in, you've got to just watch out from the change of bare trustee to the trustee. So there's no change of underlying beneficial ownership because it's really the fund. But you've got to be really careful because you don't want that to trigger, if you don't do it properly, a stamp duty concession. Now, I know in WA, there's a stamp duty concession for that. So it's $20 nominal duty for that change. I suspect that other states are the same. But I know that the transfer duty or stamp duty provisions in every state are quirky and strange and not consistent. So that's really, really important to make sure that's in place. And I think that was really the genesis of having not requiring it, because if it's then going to cost you full ad valorem stamp duty, then it would just stop the from putting it in place to start with.
Well, it's typical of Australia, isn't it? We can't coordinate anything in the States, can we? So
No.
why would stamp duty be any different? We can't even
Yeah,
celebrate the same public holidays at the same time.
I
So
know.
why would
But that's
stamp
really, I
duty
feel
be
like
any
that's
different?
WA. We
Oh,
like
no,
to
no.
be a bit
It's
quirky.
across the board,
Yeah,
Gemma.
okay.
It's not, we can't blame you people in the West just for that predicament. It's absolutely across the board. I mean, I think Victoria has their Labor Day celebration completely separate to ours. I think theirs is in February. It's
Right,
really
okay.
early in the year. Ours is in October. Ours is the October long weekend. So it's not just WA, it's across the board, and yeah, another example. And of course it was highlighted during COVID, but we won't go into that. Anyway, we've run out of time as usual. So much more to discuss, but obviously they're
As
discussed for
always.
another day.
Yes.
So again, I'd just like to thank you, Gemma, for being with me to present another one of these cross-country super podcasts.
Thank you for having me.
And just thank everybody for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed discussing this topic. And thank you again to Zaga for sponsoring this session. And just one shout out, if you are enjoying our content on YouTube, please smash that like button and remember to subscribe to the channel. And apart from that, thank you again for your company. Thank you again, Jemma. And we look forward to having you join us for the next episode of the Cross Country Super Podcast. Bye for now.